Mark tightened his grip on the brown box as he made his way to Mrs. Jenkins's front door. She was one of his favorite stops, with her gentle smile and warm thank you every time he brought her mail. But today, as the door opened, he sensed something was wrong. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," he said cheerfully, but she barely met his eyes. Her shoulders hunched, her hands shaking as she took the box. That's when he noticed it, a faint mark on her pants, almost like a bruise. And her hand, mottled with purple. Before we dive into this story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. Mrs. Jenkins muttered something under her breath. But Mark couldn't catch it. He shifted his weight, feeling the sudden tension in the air. The usual warm smell of her home, lavender, maybe, was mixed with something strange. Something sharp. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but she waved him off. As she turned to go inside, she glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes held a flicker of something. Fear. Mark's stomach churned as he walked back to his truck, an uneasy feeling growing inside him. All day, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Jenkins's pale, frightened face. It was unusual for her, and he couldn't ignore the tug of worry pulling at him. Each house he visited felt a little darker, as if Mrs. Jenkins's fear had followed him. When he parked his truck back at the delivery center, he found himself looking up her address, his finger hovering over her name. Maybe he was overthinking it. But something deep down told him he needed to check back on her tomorrow. Mark was back on Maple Street the next day, his heart pounding as he approached her door. This time, he looked closer. Her clothes were loose, her eyes rimmed red. More strange marks on her arms, like bruises she hadn't noticed. "Mrs. Jenkins, is everything all right?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. She didn't answer right away, instead looking past him as if searching for something, or someone. "Mark," she finally whispered, leaning in as though to tell him a secret. Her voice trembled. "I think someone's watching me." His heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. But before he could ask more, she shut the door, leaving him alone in silence. He promised himself he'd come back tomorrow, just to make sure she was safe. The next morning, Mark parked his truck outside Mrs. Jenkins's house, heart thudding in his chest. Her curtains were drawn, and the house seemed unusually still. He stepped onto her porch, the creak of the wooden floor echoing in the quiet morning. He was about to knock when he saw something, movement in the window, a shadow flitting by. It was quick, almost like a trick of the light. But Mark knew he hadn't imagined it. He knocked. Hoping she'd answer quickly, hoping she was okay. After a long, tense moment, the door cracked open, and there she stood. Mrs. Jenkins looked smaller, frilier than ever. Her face was pale, her eyes darting back and forth like she was expecting someone, or something, to jump out. "Hello, Mark," she whispered. Her voice was barely there, thin as paper. She stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. "Please, come in. I don't feel safe." Mark's pulse quickened. He had never been inside her home before, but he knew he had to follow her. Something was deeply wrong, and he needed to find out what. Stepping inside, Mark felt a chill. The once cozy home was filled with shadows and an unsettling silence. The usual fresh scent was gone, replaced by an odd, stale smell. The curtains were drawn tight, and the room was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. Mrs. Jenkins sat down slowly on her old armchair, her hands wringing nervously. She looked up at him, her face tight with worry. I haven't been sleeping," she murmured. "There's been strange noises at night. And sometimes I feel like someone's here." As she talked, Mark couldn't help but notice the new bruises on her arms and legs, the faint scratches along her wrists. "Have you told anyone about this?" he asked gently, trying not to let the alarm show on his face. She shook her head, looking down. "No one would believe me. They'd think it's just an old woman's imagination." Her voice wavered, as if she were holding back tears. Mark's heart ached for her, feeling her fear like it was his own. But he knew he couldn't just leave her like this. Suddenly, there was a faint noise from the back of the house. A slow, creaking sound, like a door opening, or maybe the floorboards shifting. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes widened, and she gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles white. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely breathing. Mark nodded, his own heart pounding. He couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was indeed watching them. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Mark knew he couldn't leave her alone, but he also knew it was time to get help. Mark took a deep breath and pulled out his phone, giving Mrs. Jenkins a reassuring look. "I'm going to call someone who can help," he said gently. "You're not alone in this, Mrs. Jenkins." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, and for a moment, Mark could see how relieved she was to have someone there with her. As he dialed, he glanced around, taking in every detail of the room, the family photos on the wall, the worn quilt on the couch, the ticking clock on the mantel. This was her home, her sanctuary, and someone had filled it with fear. He wouldn't let that go unanswered, while they waited for help. Mark sat beside her, listening as she spoke in a low, shaky voice. She told him about the whispers she sometimes heard at night, the feeling of being watched even when she was alone. She described a shadow she'd seen passing by her window late one night. "It's like I'm trapped in my own house," she whispered. "And no one even knows." Mark listened, feeling a surge of protectiveness and anger that someone would dare make her feel this way. He reached over, gently patting her hand. "You're safe now. We're going to figure this out together." A knock on the door broke the tension, and Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The police had arrived. 2 officers entered. Their expression serious as they listened to Mrs. Jenkins's account. They took notes, looking around the house with sharp, assessing eyes. One officer, a woman named Officer Diaz, knelt beside Mrs. Jenkins. "We're here to help," she said softly. "If there's someone out there, we'll find them." Her voice was steady and calm, and Mark saw Mrs. Jenkins relax, if only a little. The officers moved through the house, checking each room carefully, examining the locks on the windows and doors. Mrs. Jenkins clutched Mark's arm, her fear palpable as she watched them. She seemed so small, so vulnerable, and Mark felt a surge of determination to make sure she was safe. The officers found nothing unusual. But there was an undeniable tension in the air, a lingering sense of unease. Mark could feel it too, as if the house itself held secrets, whispering of something hidden just out of sight. As they reached the last room, Officer Diaz paused, her flashlight sweeping across the floor. She frowned, bending down to examine a small, dark stain by the bed. "This looks fresh," she murmured, glancing up at Mark and Mrs. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins looked stricken, her face pale. I don't know how that got there," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine, realizing that whatever was haunting her home was more real than he had thought. When they returned to the living room, Officer Diaz asked if Mrs. Jenkins had noticed anything else unusual. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, then pulled a crumpled note from her pocket. It was scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Leave this place, or else." Mark's jaw tightened. Someone was threatening her. Someone was inside her home, leaving marks and notes, filling her world with fear. He couldn't bear the thought of her living in such terror. "We're going to find out who did this," he said, more determined than ever. Officer Diaz studied the note, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "Mrs. Jenkins," she asked gently, "has anyone else visited you recently? Family, friends, neighbors?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "No. I don't have many visitors these days. My daughter moved out of state, and most of my friends. Well, they're gone." Her voice cracked a little, a reminder of the loneliness she carried. Mark felt his heart ache for her, but now he was also alert, knowing someone had come into her home with ill intentions. Just as Officer Diaz was about to respond, a faint creak sounded from the hallway, as if someone was walking softly on the old wooden floor. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, and he noticed Mrs. Jenkins flinch. She clutched his arm tightly, her nails digging in slightly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Officer Diaz signaled for silence, her hand moving to her holster. The other officer, Officer Grant, moved slowly down the hall, his footsteps quiet but purposeful, his flashlight illuminating the shadowy corridor. As Officer Grant reached the end of the hallway, he stopped, his flashlight beam catching something odd on a small table by the door. He called for Diaz and Mark, who joined him and looked down at what he'd found, a set of keys and a worn-out baseball cap, neither of which belonged to Mrs. Jenkins. Mark felt his throat tighten. Someone had been in the house recently, someone close enough to leave behind personal items. The officers exchanged a grim look. They knew this was more than just an old woman's imagination. The threat was real. Mrs. Jenkins looked at the cap and keys with a mixture of confusion and fear. Those aren't mine," she murmured. I think I've seen that hat before. There was a man, maybe last week, watching from across the street." Officer Diaz's face grew tense. "Did he try to talk to you?" "No," Mrs. Jenkins whispered. "But I could feel him watching. He looked angry." She began to tremble, her eyes wide with terror. Mark felt a fierce need to protect her, to keep her safe from whoever was threatening her. Officer Diaz nodded to Officer Grant, and he stepped aside to call for backup. "We're going to have a patrol car parked outside your home for the next few nights, Mrs. Jenkins," Diaz said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll make sure you're safe." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, but her face was still pale, her body tense with fear. Mark gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm here, too. You're not alone," he promised. She looked at him gratefully, her eyes filling with tears. He had become her only source of comfort in this storm of fear. The minutes stretched on as they waited for backup to arrive. Mark and Mrs. Jenkins sat in the dimly lit living room, listening to the ticking clock and every tiny creak of the house. The shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, as the silence settled around them. Mark's senses were on high alert, his ears straining for any unusual sound. Beside him, Mrs. Jenkins was quiet, but he could feel her tension, her fear. He whispered reassuring words, promising her that she would be safe, that they wouldn't let anyone hurt her. As they waited, Officer Diaz continued to examine the room, her eyes sharp, her movements purposeful. She approached the fireplace and noticed something tucked beneath the mantel, a crumpled piece of paper. She unfolded it, her eyes narrowing as she read. It was another note, written in the same shaky handwriting: "You're being watched. Leave, or face the consequences." Diaz's expression grew darker as she showed it to Mark and Mrs. Jenkins. The sense of danger grew even sharper, and Mark felt a surge of protectiveness over the elderly woman beside him. Just then, a loud crash shattered the silence, a window breaking somewhere in the house. Mrs. Jenkins gasped, clutching her chest in fear. Mark's heart pounded as he stood, scanning the room, trying to locate the source of the sound. Officer Diaz and Officer Grant exchanged quick, worried glances. Mark took a step toward the hallway, but Officer Diaz held up a hand, signaling him to stay back. "We'll check it out," she said, her voice low but steady. Mark nodded, staying close to Mrs. Jenkins, ready to shield her from whatever might come next. Officers Diaz and Grant moved cautiously down the hallway, flashlights illuminating the path before them. They reached the back of the house, where they found a shattered window, glass scattered across the floor. The chilly night air seeped in, carrying with it an eerie silence. Mark held Mrs. Jenkins's hand tightly, his own fear growing as he waited for the officers to return. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been watching her wasn't far. They were close, too close, and the thought sent a chill down his spine. As the officers inspected the broken window, Officer Grant spotted something scrawled on the wall outside, barely visible in the dim light. Written in a shaky, almost desperate hand were the words, "This is your last warning." Officer Diaz's face hardened. This was no longer a simple case of trespassing. It was a targeted threat. Someone wanted Mrs. Jenkins out of her home. They wanted her scared, and they were willing to go to great lengths to make sure she understood that. Backup finally arrived, and the officers quickly spread out to question the neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard something unusual. Mark stayed with Mrs. Jenkins, comforting her as she sat trembling in her chair. One of the neighbors, Mr. Collins, recalled seeing a man lingering around Mrs. Jenkins's house late at night. "He looked rough," Mr. Collins muttered. "I figured he was just passing through, but now I'm not so sure." The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was dark and menacing. As the police gathered information, Mark sat beside Mrs. Jenkins, a silent promise forming in his heart. He would not leave her alone in this. Whatever was happening, whatever danger lurked, he would be there to help her face it. Mrs. Jenkins reached out, gripping his hand tightly. Her fear was evident, but so was her gratitude. "Thank you, Mark," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Mark smiled, hoping to reassure her. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I'll be here." As the night wore on, Officer Diaz returned to Mrs. Jenkins, her face set with determination. "We're going to station officers nearby, but we also need to figure out who's behind this," she said. "I'd suggest installing some security cameras around the house. Whoever this is, they won't go undetected for long." Mark felt a flicker of hope. Cameras might be the key to catching this intruder in the act, to finally giving Mrs. Jenkins the peace she deserved. She nodded, looking at Mark with a sense of relief. Together, they were taking the first steps to reclaim her home. With the police outside and the promise of cameras being installed, the house finally fell into a deep silence. Mrs. Jenkins seemed more at ease, and even Mark felt a weight lift, if only slightly. The night was dark and still, and for the first time, it seemed like they might have a chance to uncover the truth. But as Mark closed the door behind him, leaving Mrs. Jenkins to rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The shadow in her life was still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And he knew that when it did, he'd be there, ready to face it by her side. The next morning, a team arrived to install security cameras around Mrs. Jenkins's house. Mark watched as they positioned the cameras carefully, making sure to cover all the key areas, the front porch, the backyard, and the hallway near her bedroom. Mrs. Jenkins sat nearby, watching with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety, as one of the installers finished setting up the last camera. He handed Mrs. Jenkins a remote control, showing her how to use it. "These cameras will record everything," he explained. "If anyone comes by, you'll know." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, holding the remote tightly. Mark could see that, despite the security measures, she was still afraid. After the cameras were installed, Mark decided to stay with Mrs. Jenkins for a while, keeping her company and making sure she felt safe. They sat in her cozy living room, the sun streaming through the windows, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled over the house. Mark tried to lift her spirits by talking about happy memories and sharing stories from his life. Mrs. Jenkins laughed softly. Her smile small but genuine. Yet, every few moments, her gaze would drift to the window, as if expecting to see someone lurking outside. The fear hadn't left her eyes. Later that day, Officer Diaz returned to check on Mrs. Jenkins and see if the cameras had picked up any activity. She showed Mark and Mrs. Jenkins how to review the footage, scrolling through hours of recordings. For a while, everything seemed normal, just a quiet house in a peaceful neighborhood, but as they watched the footage from the early hours of the morning, they noticed something strange. A shadow flickered across the backyard camera, just for a second, before disappearing. Mark's heart raced as he realized someone had been there. Watching, just beyond the reach of the cameras, Officer Diaz rewound the footage, zooming in on the shadow, but the image was blurry. All they could make out was a faint outline, someone lurking near the fence, watching the house. Mrs. Jenkins gripped Mark's hand tightly, her face pale as she stared at the screen. "Do you recognize that shape?" Officer Diaz asked her. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head slowly, fear clear in her eyes. "No, but I can feel that whoever it is, they're dangerous. They don't want me here." Mark felt a wave of protectiveness surge through him. He wouldn't let anyone hurt her. As they continued checking the footage, Mrs. Jenkins suddenly remembered something. "There's a room in the basement. It's been locked ever since I moved in," she murmured. Mark and Officer Diaz exchanged a glance, the thought of an undiscovered space adding a new layer to the mystery. "Have you ever tried to open it?" Mark asked gently. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "The key was lost, and I never thought much about it. But now, with everything that had happened, the locked room seemed far from innocent. It might hold answers, or even more secrets." Determined to open the locked room, Mark and Officer Diaz searched the house for the key. Mrs. Jenkins led them to an old drawer filled with knickknacks and keepsakes, hoping it might be hidden there. The search was tense. With every tiny object holding a possibility, finally, they found a small, rusted key tucked inside a jewelry box. Mrs. Jenkins held it up, her hands trembling slightly. This must be it, she whispered, as if the key itself held secrets from the past. Mark felt his pulse quicken. They were one step closer to uncovering the truth. Mark, Mrs. Jenkins, and Officer Diaz descended into the basement, where the locked door stood at the far end of the room, shrouded in shadows. Mrs. Jenkins handed the key to Mark, her fingers cold with fear. With a steady hand, he inserted it into the lock, hearing the faint click as it turned. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with dust and the scent of age. Boxes lined the walls, some labeled with dates, others with names that Mrs. Jenkins didn't recognize. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. Whatever secrets were hidden here, they had been waiting a long time to be found. Inside the room, they found boxes filled with old letters, photos, and keepsakes from someone's past. As they sifted through the dusty contents, Mrs. Jenkins's eyes grew wide. These things. They belong to the family who lived here before me, she whispered, as if the walls themselves were listening. Mark picked up an old, faded photo, showing a young woman with a gentle smile. Do you know who this is? He asked. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. No, but something tells me her story didn't end happily. Mark felt a sense of sadness, wondering what the photo could reveal about the house's troubled past. As they sorted through the items, Mark came across a sealed envelope tucked between two boxes. He opened it carefully, revealing a letter written in a shaky, almost desperate handwriting. The message was short but haunting. They're watching. Don't stay here alone. Mark felt a chill as he read the words aloud. Mrs. Jenkins's face grew pale, and Officer Diaz's expression hardened. Whoever had lived here before had known fear, fear that echoed through the years, haunting whoever crossed its path. Mark knew they were up against something far more sinister than they'd imagined. After finding the letter, Officer Diaz turned her attention back to the strange marks on Mrs. Jenkins's pants. These marks, they aren't random. They could be a message, or a warning, she said thoughtfully. She examined the fabric closely, looking for any patterns or signs. Mrs. Jenkins's hands shook as she clutched the edge of her sweater. But why would anyone want to warn me? I'm just an old woman. Her voice trailed off, a mix of sadness and fear. Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out, Mrs. Jenkins. You're not alone. As they continued to explore the basement, Mrs. Jenkins began to remember small details about the family who'd lived there before. The woman in that picture. I think her name was Evelyn. She was quiet, kind. But there was something in her eyes. Sadness, maybe. Mark listened closely, feeling a connection to this woman he'd never met. The sadness Mrs. Jenkins described felt heavy, lingering like a shadow over the room. What happened to her? He asked softly, hoping the answer would shed light on the mystery. Officer Diaz decided to visit a neighbor who had lived on the street for decades, hoping they might know more about Evelyn and her family. Mr. Collins, a retired history teacher, remembered the family well. Evelyn was a sweet woman. Always looking out for others, he recalled, a somber expression on his face, but something changed. She started acting strange, looking over her shoulder, locking her doors during the day. Then, one night, she vanished. The word sent a chill through Mark and Mrs. Jenkins. Evelyn had disappeared, leaving behind only the haunted house they now stood in. Mr. Collins recounted the last time he'd seen Evelyn. She was leaving her house in a hurry, a terrified look in her eyes. She whispered to me, "They're coming for me," and then she was gone. He shook his head, his voice filled with regret. Mark felt a knot of fear in his stomach. Evelyn's words echoed the same fear Mrs. Jenkins felt now. Whoever had haunted Evelyn's life might still be lingering, targeting Mrs. Jenkins in the same way. But Mark was determined, he wouldn't let history repeat itself. That night, after the officers left, Mark stayed with Mrs. Jenkins, keeping her company as they continued piecing together the clues. As they sat by the dim glow of a single lamp, Mrs. Jenkins turned to Mark, her face pale. What if Evelyn never really left? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The question lingered in the air, heavy and unsettling. Mark felt his heart race as he thought of the shadows, the strange marks, the sense of being watched. What if Evelyn's spirit, or her tormentor, had stayed within these walls, haunting anyone who dared live there? As midnight approached, Mark sat silently, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, hiding just out of sight. Just as he was about to speak, Mrs. Jenkins turned to him with wide eyes. I keep hearing whispers," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Mark leaned in, straining to listen, but the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Still, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What had happened in this house, and who, or what, was trying to send them a message? Later that night, while Mark was checking the locks on the doors, he noticed something strange. A shadow seemed to move down the hallway, stopping just outside Mrs. Jenkins's room. Mark's heart pounded as he approached, trying to stay calm, but when he turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The only sign that something had been there was the faint sound of whispering, fading as quickly as it had come. Mark knew it wasn't his imagination. Something was lurking, waiting, and it was getting closer. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins found an old journal tucked in one of the boxes in the locked room. It was worn, with pages yellowed by age. Scrawled across the front was a name, Evelyn. Mrs. Jenkins handed it to Mark, her hands shaking slightly. "I think she wanted us to find this," she whispered. As Mark opened the journal, he could feel the weight of Evelyn's story. The first few pages were filled with happy memories, but as he read on, the entries grew darker. Evelyn had written about someone watching her, leaving strange marks on her belongings, and how her life had become a waking nightmare. Reading Evelyn's words was like stepping into her world. She wrote about feeling trapped, unable to escape the terror that surrounded her. "They come at night, whispering my name," one entry read. "I don't know who they are, but I feel them everywhere. I don't know how much longer I can stay here." Mark's hands trembled as he turned the page. Evelyn had felt the same fear Mrs. Jenkins was feeling now. He realized that whatever had haunted Evelyn hadn't left, it had just been waiting, lurking, for someone else to prey on. Mark continued to read the journal, flipping to the last entry Evelyn had written. Her handwriting was shaky, her words frantic. "If anyone finds this, please, leave this house. It's not safe. They won't stop until they have what they want." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Evelyn had tried to warn them, tried to leave a message for anyone who followed. Mrs. Jenkins's face was pale as she listened. "What do you think they wanted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing: they needed to find out before it was too late. Mark decided to dig deeper, hoping to find any clues that could explain who, or what, was haunting Mrs. Jenkins. He contacted Officer Diaz, asking her to check the records on the house's history. Mrs. Jenkins had lived there for years, but what about before that? Who had lived there, and why did they leave? As they waited for answers, Mark and Mrs. Jenkins pored over the journal, looking for clues. Every entry was filled with Evelyn's growing fear, her desperation to escape. But one thing was clear: Evelyn had been running from something very real. Later that day, Officer Diaz called with unsettling news. She had found reports of other residents who had lived in the house before Evelyn. Every one of them had moved out under mysterious circumstances, some even abandoning their belongings. They all reported similar things: sounds, shadows, strange marks appearing on their clothes and walls, Officer Diaz explained. Mark felt a shiver run through him. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a pattern, stretching back years. Mrs. Jenkins was just the latest victim in a long line. As night fell, Mark and Mrs. Jenkins prepared for whatever might come. They locked every door, checked the cameras, and kept the lights on. But despite their precautions, a sense of dread hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Jenkins clutched her pendant, her face pale with fear. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed from the front door, startling them both. Mark grabbed a flashlight, his heart racing. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there, just the cold, empty night. Yet, somehow, he knew they weren't alone. The next morning, as Mark was getting ready to leave, an elderly man appeared at the door. He introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, a former neighbor who had known Evelyn. "I heard about what's been happening," he said. "And I thought you might want to know the truth." Mrs. Jenkins and Mark invited him in, eager for any information. Mr. Grayson explained that Evelyn had once confided in him, saying she was being followed by a dark presence. She believed the house was cursed, he said quietly. And that anyone who lived here would be marked. Mr. Grayson shared an old story about the house's first owner, a reclusive man named Samuel who practiced strange rituals. Rumor had it that Samuel had cursed the property, binding it with dark forces that would haunt anyone who lived there. Evelyn had believed that the curse had followed her, slowly destroying her life. Mark felt a chill as he listened. This curse, if real, could explain the strange events, the shadows, and the fear that gripped the house. He looked at Mrs. Jenkins, who was pale with fear. How could they fight something so old and powerful? Desperate for a solution, Mark asked Mr. Grayson if there was any way to break the curse. Mr. Grayson hesitated, then explained that Evelyn had once tried a protection ritual, using salt, sage, and symbols of protection. "It might help," he said softly, though his tone was doubtful. Mrs. Jenkins agreed to try, despite her fear. That evening, they gathered everything they needed, creating a circle of salt around the house and burning sage to cleanse the space. Mark hoped that this simple ritual might bring peace, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to break a curse. That night, the house seemed quieter, the air lighter. Mrs. Jenkins dared to hope that the ritual had worked. But as midnight approached, the whispers returned, filling the hallways and slipping into every corner of the house. This time, they were louder, more desperate, as if something was trying to break through. Mark sat by Mrs. Jenkins's side, gripping her hand. He could feel her fear, and he knew that whatever they faced, they would face it together. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't a warning, they were a threat. Mark realized that he had to confront the entity haunting the house. Even if it meant risking everything. He asked Mrs. Jenkins to stay in her room while he ventured into the basement, hoping to find answers in the darkness. The air was thick, heavy with an unseen presence. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the whispers grew louder, surrounding him from all sides. Mark stood his ground, refusing to let the fear control him. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice steady. For a moment, the whispers fell silent, as if the entity was listening. A shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the basement, faint and flickering, like a flame in the dark. Mark felt his heart race, but he held his ground. The figure moved closer, its face blurred, but its eyes full of sorrow. It pointed to a spot on the ground, and Mark understood, it was showing him something. Mark knelt down, brushing aside the dust. Beneath his fingers, he felt something solid, buried beneath the floorboards. He pried it loose, revealing a small box, its lid sealed tight. Mark felt a shiver run through him. Whatever was inside, it held the answers they needed. Back in the living room, Mark carefully opened the box, revealing a letter written by Evelyn. Her words were full of despair, describing how the curse had taken over her life, driving her to madness. "I tried to break free," she wrote. "But the house won't let me go. It feeds on fear, and as long as someone lives here, it will never stop." Mark felt a chill as he read. Evelyn had been trapped, haunted by the very walls around her. And now, Mrs. Jenkins was facing the same fate. But Mark refused to let the curse claim another life. With Evelyn's letter as their guide, Mark and Mrs. Jenkins devised a plan to break the curse once and for all. They gathered symbols of light and hope, filling the house with items that represented peace and love. Mrs. Jenkins placed flowers in every room, and Mark placed candles in the corners of the rooms, lighting each one with a sense of determination. "This is it," Mark whispered. "We're going to fight back." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her hands clasped in prayer. They had to put everything they had into this plan if they wanted to survive the curse. As they completed the final steps of their ritual, a deep, unsettling silence fell over the house. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. But then, something changed. The whispers stopped. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, just as they thought the worst had passed, the silence was broken by a loud crash from upstairs. Mark and Mrs. Jenkins froze. The house seemed to tremble, as if something was stirring within the walls, desperate to escape. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. "It's not over," he said, his voice trembling. Mrs. Jenkins looked at him with wide eyes, fear etched on her face. "What do we do now?" she asked, clutching her pendant tightly. They had to face whatever was coming, no matter how terrifying it was. Mark rushed upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The air was thick, and every shadow seemed to move as if alive. He found Mrs. Jenkins's bedroom door wide open. Inside, the room was empty, except for the eerie glow coming from the window, but then, he saw it. A figure standing at the foot of the bed, its form shifting, its face distorted by darkness. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Leave her alone," he shouted, stepping forward, but the figure remained silent. The figure turned toward Mark, its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. The whispers returned, now louder than ever, swirling around him, filling his mind with confusion and dread. Mark stumbled back, trying to block out the noise. But it was impossible. The entity was stronger than anything they had encountered before. Suddenly, the floor beneath Mark's feet cracked, and the house seemed to groan under the pressure. The curse had fully awakened, and the entity was no longer hiding. It was ready to claim what it had been waiting for all this time. Mark felt his legs buckle under the weight of the fear pressing down on him. But then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, holding the pendant tightly in her hand. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "You don't control us," she said, her words ringing with power. The entity shrieked, its form flickering. For a moment, it seemed like it might retreat. Mark glanced at Mrs. Jenkins, amazed by her courage. "It's weakening," he said, but they both knew they weren't out of danger yet. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the walls seemed to cave in as the entity roared in anger. "Leave now, or it will consume you," it hissed, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Mark and Mrs. Jenkins stood their ground. "We won't let you win," Mark said, his voice trembling but firm. "You've taken enough from us." The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw the shadow of Evelyn standing behind Mrs. Jenkins, her face determined. With a burst of strength, Mark and Mrs. Jenkins pressed forward, placing their hands on the walls of the room, reciting the protective words they had learned from Evelyn's journal. The curse seemed to writhe and twist, struggling against the force they were unleashing. The house seemed to groan as the curse fought back. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. The shadows became deeper, more oppressive. But Mark and Mrs. Jenkins didn't stop. They kept chanting, their voices growing louder and more confident. With a sudden flash of light, the entity screamed one last time, a sound that shook the very foundation of the house. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only silence. The room fell silent, the oppressive air lifting as if a great weight had been removed. Mark and Mrs. Jenkins stood in stunned silence, their hearts pounding. They had won. The curse was broken, and the house felt lighter, the shadows no longer clinging to the walls. Mrs. Jenkins let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "We did it," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. Mark nodded, relief flooding through him. But even as they stood there, a sense of unease lingered in the air. Was it truly over? Or had they merely postponed the inevitable? Over the next few days, Mark and Mrs. Jenkins cleaned the house, removing the remnants of the dark presence that had once clung to the walls. The house felt different now, quieter, almost peaceful. But the events of the past weeks still haunted them. Like a shadow lurking just beyond their reach, Mark visited Officer Diaz again, updating her on the situation. "The curse is broken," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "But I still don't fully understand what happened here." Officer Diaz listened, her expression serious. "You may never understand," she said. "Some things in this world are beyond explanation." Mrs. Jenkins stood in the doorway of the house one last time, looking out over the garden. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard. It felt like a new beginning, even though the past would never be truly erased. Mark joined her, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You're free now," he said softly. "You can finally leave this place behind." she smiled, a bittersweet expression on her face. I don't know if I'll ever leave. But I'm not afraid anymore. Her voice was steady, a new strength shining through. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Jenkins decided to stay in the house. The curse had been broken, but the memories of what had happened would always remain. Mark continued to check in on her, making sure she was okay, and they both found comfort in knowing they had faced something dark and come out stronger on the other side. As for Mark, he knew that some things could never be fully explained. But one thing was certain, he would never forget the night they broke the curse. It had changed him forever. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of healing. And that, in the end, was enough. Mark stood in front of the house one early morning, watching the sunrise slowly spread its warm light across the garden. The once ominous house now looked peaceful, as though the darkness that had plagued it had finally lifted. Mrs. Jenkins had made the decision to stay, to rebuild her life in the very place that had once been the site of so much fear. He smiled, knowing that she had found the strength to move forward. But as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover about what had happened. The whispers, the shadows, the dark figure, it all felt like a puzzle that wasn't entirely solved. A knock at the door pulled Mark from his thoughts. He turned, walking quickly toward the sound. When he opened the door, he found Evelyn standing there, looking older but still strong. Evelyn? Mark asked, surprised but happy to see her. What are you doing here? I had to come, Evelyn said softly, stepping inside. I've been having strange dreams. About you, about Mrs. Jenkins, about the house. I think there's still something we missed. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped it was over, but he knew deep down that something had always felt unfinished. What do you mean? I thought we broke the curse. Evelyn looked at him with a serious expression. The curse might be broken, but there's still unfinished business. Something was left behind. They gathered in the living room, where the air still felt heavy with the remnants of what had once been. Evelyn sat down, and Mark joined her. Tell me what's going on, he urged. What do you think we missed? Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then began. When we broke the curse, we thought we were finished. But I think there's more to the house than we realized. This house wasn't just haunted. It was built on land that holds a history darker than we knew. And I think that history still lingers here. Mark listened closely, his mind racing with questions. What kind of history? What happened here? Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. This land was once part of an old asylum, a place where patients were mistreated, abandoned, and left to suffer. Their anger never truly left. It's been trapped here, waiting for the right moment to surface. Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. You think the curse was just a symptom of something bigger? That the land itself is cursed? Evelyn nodded solemnly. Yes. The curse wasn't just a single haunting, it was a reflection of the pain and suffering that took place here. And I fear that while we broke the immediate curse, the land may still hold on to its grief, but how can we stop it? Mark asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes steely with determination. We need to do what was never done before. We need to help those lost souls move on. Only then can the land be at peace. The next day, Evelyn and Mark went to the local library. They pored over old records, newspapers, and documents that detailed the asylum's dark past. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the pain ran. The asylum had been built in the late 1800s, and the conditions had been horrific. Patients were locked away in isolation, their cries unheard by the outside world. Many had died there. Their spirits restless and angry. Mark felt a growing sense of urgency. We need to find a way to free them. But how? Evelyn took a deep breath. I think I know. There's a ritual, a way to release the trapped souls, but it requires something important, a symbol of forgiveness. Something that ties the past to the present, something that acknowledges the suffering and releases the pain. They spent the next few days searching for the symbol Evelyn had mentioned. They learned that it was an old relic, a pendant shaped like a dove, used by the asylum's original staff as a sign of peace and hope. It had been lost during the asylum's closure, but they believed that if they could find it, they could use it to heal the land. Mark felt hopeful, but also wary. This was their last chance to truly free the land from its painful past. In the attic of the house, Mark stumbled upon a small, dusty box hidden beneath old blankets. His heart raced as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a pendant. The pendant of a dove, just as Evelyn had described. It looked ancient, its edges worn with age, but its presence was undeniable. He hurried downstairs to show Evelyn. When she saw the pendant, her eyes widened. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "This is what we need." Mark felt a surge of hope. "We can finally put this to rest." But as he held the pendant in his hand, a strange energy pulsed through the room, and the air grew cold. Something wasn't right. The room seemed to darken, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on them. Evelyn and Mark exchanged a look of fear. "It's not over," Evelyn whispered. "The land knows we found it. It's trying to stop us." Suddenly, the ground shook, and the walls seemed to groan as though the house was alive, fighting against them. A deep, guttural growl echoed from beneath the floorboards, making Mark's blood run cold. "We have to act fast." Mark shouted. They rushed outside, carrying the pendant with them. As they reached the center of the garden, the ground beneath their feet trembled once more. The land seemed to fight them, as if it didn't want to be healed. Mark and Evelyn stood together in the garden, holding the pendant. The wind began to howl, and the sky darkened. Evelyn began chanting in a language Mark didn't recognize. The pendant in his hand grew warmer, pulsing with a strange energy. As the chanting grew louder, the air around them crackled. Mark could feel the land's anger, its resentment, its sorrow. The voices of the lost souls whispered in his ears, pleading for release. "Let them go," Evelyn whispered, her voice steady with resolve. "Let them find peace." The pendant suddenly shone with blinding light, and the ground beneath them stopped trembling. The wind died down. And the sky cleared. For the first time in years, the garden felt calm. Mark looked around, amazed. The house, the land, everything had changed. The air was lighter, the shadows had faded, and the heavy weight that had once clung to the place was gone. Evelyn smiled, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "It's over," she whispered. "We did it," Mark nodded, feeling the peace settle around him. The land was finally free, and so were they. With the curse lifted and the land at peace, Mrs. Jenkins began to rebuild her life, finding joy in the house once more. Mark visited often, making sure she was okay, and they became a kind of family. The house, now a home, was filled with laughter and warmth. A stark contrast to the fear that once lived there. Evelyn, too, found peace. She decided to stay nearby, often helping Mark and Mrs. Jenkins with the house and its upkeep, and as for Mark, he knew that the journey had changed him. He would never forget the darkness they had faced, but he also knew that they had turned the page to a new chapter, one filled with light, love, and hope. The story of the house was no longer one of fear, but one of healing. And as Mark stood on the porch one last time, watching the sun set on a peaceful world, he knew that no matter what came next, they had the strength to face it. The darkness was gone, and in its place, they had found a new beginning. And that was all they could ever need.